The release order of the Trails games in English have been pretty all over the place, with Trails in the Sky and Trails of Cold Steel having alternating releases. And once upon a time, fans just kinda had to accept that they had to take what they could get. And because of this, I always had the very reasonable assumption that Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure, being late PSP games, would never get over that language barrier and make it here to the West, especially with just how much text this series is infamous for having in each game. Luckily, the stars aligned, and thanks to the very hard-working people down at the Geofront, a fan translation of both games meant that the duology became fully playable in English. A couple of remasters and some script purchases later meant that the impossible event of Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure finally being not only translated, but officially released in English came true. But the question is, does this PSP game still hold up today, and how did these new ports to the PS4, the Switch, and the PC compare to past releases as well as each other? Trails from Zero is the fourth game in the Trails or Kiseki series, but the first in the Crossbell duology, and that means, contrary to popular belief, you can in fact start here. There is one or two plot threads from the previous Trails in the Sky trilogy that do get continued or tied up in this game, but barring the one purple exception, none of them are really going to affect your enjoyment all that much if you do happen to start with this one. That being said, the reason I referred to this as the Crossbell arc is because these games both take place in the city-state of Crossbell, a small region sandwiched between two global superpowers with highly strung political tensions with each other. As such, the city is a breeding ground for crime and corruption, since it acts as a sort of political no man's land for both the state's upper crust, but also for the neighbouring countries as well. Because of this, the police is also pretty much completely corrupt, and the whole city would rather go to the Bracer Guild for help instead. An organisation of private detectives slash handymen slash monster slayers, all equipped with pocket watches that shoot fireballs out of them. A world where cops can't be trusted? What will fiction think of next, am I right? Because of this, the CPD decide, after getting drunk and watching Police Academy 4 Citizens on Patrol one night, to form the Special Support Section, a small task force designed to mimic the Bracer Guild, in hopes that they can mend the police's reputation with the people. And this is where our party comes into play, featuring Lloyd Mannings, a fresh new recruit straight out of training, who aced his detective exam before even joining the force. Ellie McDowell, the granddaughter to the town's mayor, who desires to get first-hand experience of the city's shady underbelly to become someone who's able to actually stop it and make a difference. Tio Plato, a young girl and computer genius who is assigned to test new weapons and equipment produced by the Epstein Foundation, such as the newest model of magic pocket watches that I mentioned before. And finally, last but not least, Randy Orlando, a first lieutenant of the sort of border control monster extermination group known as the Crossbell Guard, who was nearly fired for skirt chasing, which lands him firmly in my Himbo Oni-chan with a dark past squad, one of my personal favourite Falcom tropes, alongside hot quirky nuns and farm girls who can fold you in two. There's plenty of characters in supporting roles, as well as some occasional guest characters who will join the party for a dungeon or a boss every now and then. But for most of the game, it's just these four. Pretty small compared to most JRPGs, especially compared to some of the rosters you have available in the later Cold Steel games. But with Falcom's writing style, I always felt like they were really struggling to have everybody contribute something in those scenes. Whereas in Trails from Zero, having such an intimate cast allows for everybody to fully flesh themselves out, and it means that the SSS can really become so much more than the sum of their parts. While Tio and Randy are my standout favourites of the group, being the main source of a lot of the more humorous moments thanks to Randy's devil may care attitude to, well, life, and Tio's dry and deadpan way of dealing with people, the two of them really never fail to make me smile.
Agate Antida.
Sitting in a tree.
Kissing.
And when you throw in their backgrounds and their growth throughout the games into the mix, you create two of the Trails series' most lovable characters. Lloyd, on the other hand, perfectly fulfills his role as leader by being a great foundation to the group and the lead driving force to the plot, whilst also being able to be the straight man in a lot of Tio and Randy's antics. And while he does suffer a bit from main character syndrome, resulting in him feeling a little bit vanilla here and there, he does have a surprisingly hot-blooded hero underneath that composed professional that he forged at the police academy, resulting in some, frankly, great badass moments at several points in the game. If Reen from Cold Steel is a shonen protagonist, Lloyd is definitely a protag of a seinen anime. There is absolutely a burning heart underneath that uniform, but he's also mature enough to know that he needs more than just passion to deal with a lot of the team's problems. And finally we have Ellie, who I really think is the best example of that more than the sum of their parts aspect that I was talking about. Ellie, being the granddaughter of one of Crossbell's most important politicians, as well as one of the few that aren't corrupt, means that she's often interacted with the upper crust and the nobility of not just their nation, but the other large ones as well. She can come across a little bit too highly strung and a bit of a stick in the mud at times, but if Lloyd is the foundation of the SSS, Ellie is the balancing agent, and her presence alone is a really good aspect to how the game is able to maintain its fairly serious tone, whilst also being able to have those more goofy moments. Basically, unsalted crackers and room temperature water is a really good palate cleanser, but what makes these stand out is that these crackers have herbs in them. I've kind of lost where I'm going with this. My point is that Ellie may be a very basic character, but she's very, very good at fulfilling her purpose within the narrative. What I really appreciate about having this more condensed cast, though, is that it means that while Lloyd is the protagonist, this is a game about the SSS as a whole, not just him. And much like games like Final Fantasy VI, it means that at times, the most important character at any given point in the story can shift. Shift to whatever party member properly represents the side of Crossbell's seedy underbelly that is currently being shown. Whether it be a public face such as the police force and the politicians with Lloyd and Ellie, or the players with machinations behind the scenes such as Redacted and Redacted being connected to both Tio and Randy. And with a setting so small in scope compared to the other games in the series, it means that elements are very likely to overlap with one another, meaning that even characters like Randy, who doesn't get too much to do in terms of relevance until Azure by himself, still has a very proper place with what's currently transpiring. It also means that with a more compact main cast, the game can be more efficient with its storytelling, so side characters such as Dudley, Wazzy, and Chief Sergey also get plenty of time to flourish and do their own thing. Not to mention a certain little B-plot starring some very cool braces from LaBeurle. And speaking of LaBeurle, the combat system is very much like that of Trails in the Sky, with very little when it comes to new additions. Trails from Zero opts to keep it a little bit more simple and goes for a more iterative approach with this game, as to not throw too much at new players all at once, especially since this one is still using the older, more complicated quartz system before it was reworked in Cold Steel. The battle system in Trails from Zero takes place on a square-like grid, where your positioning is just as important as the moves that you're making. On top of a basic attack, the Trails series has a very charmingly named arts and crafts system. Arts are essentially the game's magic system, in which any character can theoretically acquire any spell provided they have the right quartz equipped. Quartz is essentially the 2.0 version of the materia system from Final Fantasy VII. Each quartz will give you some sort of a stat boost or a passive ability, but will also add points of each elemental value to the line that it's slotted into. As the values get higher, more and more arts from the universal spell list will become available to that party member. Everyone has the same number of slots, but the more magic-focused characters will have fewer but longer lines that can link more quartz together, which makes it a lot easier to acquire those higher tier spells as well as a wider range of those arts. It's a system that took me nearly 2 whole games to fully wrap my head around, but that was mostly because the Sky tutorial was very wordy, and I ended up kind of just skipping over it and just focused on the stat boosts that I could get out of each quartz, and that can and will carry you if that's what you want to do. And that's because you can be like me and focus more on the crafts side of combat. Crafts are usually physical-based skills that are unique to each party member, and are performed by spending craft points. The whole system basically works like a fighting game super meter, as taking and receiving damage is what causes the bar to fill up. You can spend these points on basic crafts that work kinda like EX attacks, more powerful moves with a variety of special effects. Or you can save up your points until you get to at least 100 and cash it all out at once to perform an S-craft, your character's super attack. As I said before, I tend to focus more on crafts over arts, as they are a renewable resource that you can use in fights. And depending on the character, things like healing and buffs are still available to you if you only use crafts. And I think that's part of the Trails combat system's charm. These systems work really well side by side, allowing for both player expression with how you can build your party, but also by making each party member possess a very unique toolset. It means each one of them stand out a lot more, and you avoid problems like the original versions of Final Fantasy X and XII, which suffered from their sphere grid and license board systems, making everybody feel a little bit samey by the end game. The other unique element of Trails combat is the turn bonuses. At all times, you can see the order of everyone's next moves, enemies and party members alike. But each of those turns have a chance of a certain bonus being applied to them. These can range from things like guaranteed critical hits that even work on magic attacks and healing, to inflicting status ailments, to even all-out team attacks. The catch is, though, that these bonuses are tied to the actual turn and not the character themselves, meaning that if the turn order is changed somehow, it will shift every single one of those bonuses by 1. So you could have a situation where the boss might have a move that takes a turn to charge, but because that charge time is shorter than the usual delay before their next attack, it means that they could end up taking that 50% heal turn away from you. This does mean that you as a human player can exploit the system for your own game and steal those bonuses away from the enemy too. And while there are several ways of doing this, like speed buffs or delay attacks, there's no easier way to do this than with an S-break. On top of S-crafts already being your big powerful cinematic attacks, they can also be used to interrupt any turn, meaning that if an enemy is about to get a guaranteed critical hit, you can go, you know what, I want that instead, and dealing out a devastating super attack that does an extra 50% damage. The downside to using S-breaks over just traditional S-crafts, however, is that there is an increased delay before your next turn comes about when using them. The new parts of the combat system that are not seen in the Sky trilogy is the new combo crafts and the rarely seen support crafts. Combo crafts are basically just a slightly different variant of S-crafts. They're not possible to S-break, you have to do them on your actual turn, but the way that they work is instead of completely draining your CP meter, it will instead take 100 from 2 characters as they do a team attack. These tend to be slightly stronger than typical S-crafts, but they do cost that guaranteed 200, while an S-craft can be done with just 100 CP. The benefit of them, however, is because you're using a set amount of CP, instead of completely emptying the bar, it means that your characters aren't left very stunted after doing them. For example, Lloyd's not particularly great with magic. He's not awful, but he definitely wants to rely on his crafts a lot more. And if he does do an S-craft, he's down to nothing, which means that you'll kind of just be doing normal attacks to build up that meter again. It's nothing particularly groundbreaking, but you do get some fancy flashy super attacks out of it all, and it also allows you to balance out your party's juice a little bit more. Support skills, on the other hand, only ever really come into play during the very few moments you have guests join up with you. And barring one exception, that's something that only ever happens for very short periods. They're basically a unique skill or ability that any of your party members will use when they're sitting in your reserves. This can range between anything from a basic attack to a party-wide buff. They're an interesting little mechanic as they allow for characters that you're not using to be part of your strategy too, even if it is a fairly low activation rate. But with how little it's used in the game, there's a good chance that you might not even see all of them. Luckily, that is something that Azure definitely changes. Funnily enough, the quest and story structure is also pretty similar to that of Trails in the Sky. Since the SSS is basically an imitation of the Bracer Guild, it means that, just as before, requests are split up into one of two categories. The first type being marked with a urgent stamp, being the mandatory story quests that will move the plot forward once completed, and the ones without said stamp are your side quests, giving you some sort of reward for completing as well as world building. Opposed to just the usual rewards of small trinkets to help you on your playthrough, doing side quests is also another way of building up detective points. After every quest you will gain a certain amount of these points, and once you hit certain milestones with these, you'll receive different rewards that get increasingly stronger over time, with the final rewards being the best armor and boots in the game. Due to the way that this system works, it means that the game will reward you with better equipment much earlier on if you engage in its side content. And it's a clever little way to sort of trick you into making sure that you do all of the side content you can. What I really appreciate about this system in Trails from Zero, however, is how it handles rewarding you with bonus points. This system is basically in every Trails game in some shape or form, and you can usually get bonus points by answering certain multiple choice questions. In the other games, these questions usually revolve around how you deal with certain situations, and while the outcome doesn't ultimately change all that much, the more mature choice in each situation will result in the protagonist not embarrassing themselves and getting some bonus points to their name at the end of the chapter. The Cold Steel games uses its school setting to ask you questions about the world's lore, making sure that you keep up on the game's news and in-universe books, etc. Which is cool in its own way, but it also does feel like it punishes a more casual player who doesn't want to read up on all of that. But the equivalent in Trails from Zero is all about deductive thinking. Something that lets this JRPG lean slightly more into this game's theme as well as Lloyd's skills as a detective. It's overall less dependent on the game's background lore and more so on the main plot, and also lets the player feel smarter for being sharp enough to piece together the mystery before the characters do. And as you get the answers correct, that's something that reflects in Lloyd, really showing how he's the one who's passed the detective's exam while the rest are all there on their own means. It's a really example of some ludo-narrative harmony, as despite the fact that this is a fairly traditional RPG, they really managed to work that detective mystery element in there, and they gel together really well. One thing that does slightly differ from other Trails games is its world map, or rather its map of the tri-state area. Typically in Trails games, each chapter will have you relocate to a new major city in the country, and you'll branch out to the surrounding areas from there. Trails from Zero, however, can't do this because it only has the one city. So instead, you get a much smaller scope, but also one that's a lot more compact, resulting in the different routes out of the city feeling more like a complex spiderweb than the usual 2, maybe 3 roads you'd get in the other games. This can make the game feel a little bit claustrophobic as you're always in the same place, but at the end of the day, even if you were switching towns all the time, you'd still have an armory, an inn, and an item shop, etc. So while a change of scenery would be nice, it's not necessarily necessary, as you can just restock a lot of those things. It really just comes down to preference whether you're into an ever-changing town over ever-changing towns. This single location ordeal, however, does help elevate one of the Trails series' greater strengths, however. That being its intricate world building with a surplus of NPCs with their own names, problems, and little arcs. When constantly on the move, it can be a bit hard finding much room to care for most of these NPCs, since they'll only ever be around for one chapter and there's just so many of them. But in Trails from Zero, the residents of the city are ever present, and while getting invested in all of their stories is definitely unlikely, it does mean that if you do wish to see the continued exploits of Shan Shan, the daughter of the Calvardian restaurant owner, or Dio, the low-rank grunt trying to find his place in the Saber Vipers street gang, you're going to be able to get a lot more out of them than you would do in the other games. One problem I do have with Trails from Zero though is it's definitely a slow burn, especially at the start. This is a problem that all the first games in each Trails arc have, as they introduce you to the world and such, but I feel like it's especially severe in Trails from Zero. The early game chapters feel very disjointed, as if they were different episodes in a weekly anime or something, with the SSS quelling a gang war one week and helping with security for a stage play the next. There is eventually a payoff to all of these in the game's final acts, essentially everything from the Black Auction onwards, and it does all start tying together, but until that point, you can't really obviously tell how these plot elements are going to come together, and until these elements do begin lining up, the beginning of Zero can just feel like a bit of a slog at times. And I don't think it's particularly helped by the fact that, as it currently stands, most people outside of Japan playing Trails from Zero will be doing it after playing Trails of Cold Steel and possibly Trails in the Sky too. This means that it's the third time that you've been introduced to the world of Zemuria, arguably the fourth time if you include Cold Steel 3. And it's not even the first time that Crossbell has been introduced to us either. And because of this, it means that a lot of the things that they're explaining and going into detail about are things that you've already heard about. Meaning that in an already kind of weak early game, you're getting exposition for things that you've already received tons of exposition on. One silver lining to all of this though is that it means when the game does finally move into its last act, it pops off all the more. So even though my overall personal ranking of Trails of Zero is pretty low compared to the other games in the series, the back half is easily on par with my top 3. Now, for the remaster itself, there is a lot of praise to be said. Unfortunately, there is also one big caveat to all of this that needs to be addressed, which I'll get out of the way first. While the game is perfectly playable on PS4, if at all possible, I would avoid playing Trails from Zero on it. This port of the game is based on the original remaster made by Falcom, Zero no Kiseki Kai, and the Kai ports that Falcom has put out are all pretty low budget, barring one exception, and because of this are all pretty lacking in some shape or form, and Trails from Zero is no exception. Essentially, despite being a PS4 port, it feels like it's basically running an emulation of the original PSP release, with certain assets like character portraits and menus being replaced with those from the Evolution port, but also lacking stuff like the bonus content from said Evolution port. And the few new things that the Kai port introduced are a weirdly higher quality than everything else, making it kind of ends up feeling like this weird Frankenstein version of the game, taking various parts of different ports but not taking the best versions of what they could have taken. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about it, as well as the other Kai remasters put out by Falcom, including the one good one that they've made, then be sure to check out my port report video on Nayuta no Kiseki Kai, which will be important as this is the basis of the remaster that we'll be getting for Nayuta Boundless Trails next year. The reason I bring all of this up is because while this PS4 version is fine, it's a little embarrassing when the official product is objectively worse than what we got out of the fan translation, even if Geofront went above and beyond what fan translations usually do. Luckily, the man who made DS Fix, the mod that fixed the awful Dark Souls 1 PC port Durante, and his team PH3 have worked some absolute magic on the PC and, by extension, Switch ports of Trails from Zero. Now, if you want a full breakdown, I'll leave a link to the dev blog that fully explains everything in much greater detail, but the main gist of it all is, on top of being a very well optimized port with a ton of options like remapping controls and being able to toggle anti-aliasing even on the Switch, they've also gone ahead and added a lot of the features that the Geofront version added to the old PC port, like a log for all the dialogue in the game and a turbo mode. But they've also gone a step further than that and added some new improvements as well. The two that I feel are the most notable is that PH3 created a tool that allowed them to examine each texture from each previous version of the game and compare them all at once. From there, they can blend different parts of each texture together to make a quote-unquote perfect version, whilst also upscaling them wherever needed. The second being that they did a very similar thing to the character sprites as well. In both cases, creating a look that is absolutely free from the noise created by compression and such from the old PC port. Now, due to the nature of upscaling things, it is down to personal taste whether or not you'll like the smoother, more clean look of the official release, or the slightly more detailed but also more noisy, less consistent look of the Geofront release. One thing I'm not a particularly huge fan of is how this upscaling affects the glowing auras around characters during special moves and such. In the new release, because these transparent textures have been upscaled, they're a lot more defined, and because of this don't quite blend together how they should do, making it very easy to see the seams in each one. It's a very minor thing, but after playing the Geofront release, it is something that I felt very jarring. Outside of the actual quality of the port, the core presentation beneath it all is definitely a very timeless look, but you can tell it was made on a handheld system. Like its predecessor, Trails from Zero takes on this lovely style of having a 3D world with some wonderful 2D chibi sprites by essentially taking screenshots of incredibly high polygon character models from various different angles while they're doing their animations. It's basically like the opposite process of using pre-rendered backgrounds a la Final Fantasy and Resident Evil, with the same goal of maintaining high visual fidelity whilst also saving on performance cost. It's essentially a more improved version of what the first Grandia game was doing. By opting to go for a camera that is fixed on a rail at all times, it means that Trails from Zero can go for environments that are a lot more dense compared to Trails in the Sky. And it also means that you don't need to constantly spin the camera around to see what you're doing in tight spaces, as everything is a lot more curated. This is something that, while it works as an artistic choice, there's definitely moments like a certain view of a mountain range, for example, where it's very clear that it's limited by the PSP hardware compared to Trails in the Sky being on a PC back in the day. What isn't affected by the fact that the game was originally on the PSP though is its soundtrack, and oh boy, it's a Falcom soundtrack alright, and it stands among some of the rest of the great Falcom OSTs. Tracks like Get Over the Barrier, Inevitable Struggle, and Formidable Enemy have been in my listening rotation for a good while now, and they're not going to get kicked out of it anytime soon. In retrospect of all of this though, it's a bloody miracle that we were able to get this game at all. Looking back on it, the assumption for this game for many years was that you should just play whatever version's available right now, because it's never going to get a proper translation, be it via a spreadsheet, the original leaked Crossbell really is a city translation, or otherwise. So it really is nice to see that not only do we have the game officially in English, but we also have the definitive version with all of the best bits from all of the others, with the only real exception being the exclusive side quests from the Evolution port on the Vita. Except that doesn't have to be an exception, as while writing this video I have discovered that Falcom fans will always continue to go the extra mile. And thanks to the Inevitable Zero mod, we are able to get those few exclusive side quests from the Vita version, meaning we truly aren't leaving anything out now. And if that's not enough for you, there is also the More Portraits for Zero mod, retroactively importing character portraits from Trails to Azure back into Trails from Zero for characters who didn't have them yet when the game first released. They even have ones from the Trails gacha game Akatsuki no Kiseki, as well as a few homemade ones as well. These ones do clash a little bit compared to the ones in the vanilla game, but it's still nice to see. Unfortunately, at the time of recording, these two mods aren't currently compatible with each other, as they're both not quite fully complete yet. But both modders have expressed the desire to make the mods work together once they're both finished. And there we have it. Trails from Zero may not be my favourite game in the series, and overall, as a long-time English fan who's had to play the games in a weird order, it definitely has a lot of aspects that make it feel a little bit dragged out. But one thing for certain is that when the game is firing on all cylinders, it's the same brand of peak fiction that this series has made me fall in love with, and that's all I could ever ask for. Join us next time where we will be looking at Police Academy 6 City Under Siege. I mean, Trails to Azure.